November 23rd, 1942. A cramped, icy bunker near the village of Gumrak, just outside Stalingrad. General Friedrich Paulus, the meticulous, aristocratic commander of the German Sixth Army, stared at the map laid out on the table. The lines on it, drawn in grease pencil, formed a simple, terrifying shape. A circle. Just hours earlier, at Kalach-na-Donu, the armored spearheads of two massive Soviet fronts, north and south, had met. The trap was sprung. Paulus and his entire command, over 250,000 men, the victors of France, the conquerors of Ukraine, the very embodiment of the Third Reich's invincible Wehrmacht, were completely, unequivocally surrounded. The air in the bunker was thick with the cognitive dissonance of the situation. How could this have happened? This was the Sixth Army, a force that had known nothing but victory. Its pedigree was unmatched. Born from the 10th Army that had smashed Poland, it was redesignated as the 6th, and it performed flawlessly in the Battle of France, sweeping aside the Belgian army and helping to corner the British at Dunkirk. Under its ruthless previous commander, Walter von Reichenau, it had stormed into the Soviet Union, winning massive encirclement battles at Kiev and Kharkov. It was an army of veterans, masters of the Belagerungskrieg, the war of movement. And now, it was trapped. The hunters had become the hunted, encircled by an enemy they had been told for months was on the verge of total collapse. The story of how this invincible army was not just defeated, but utterly annihilated, is not a simple tale of General Winter, or a fight against overwhelming numbers. The Sixth Army was not beaten in a fair fight. It was strangled. It was a magnificent, sharp-toothed predator that had been lured into a cage and slowly, systematically starved to death by its own leadership's arrogance and a catastrophic, almost unbelievable, failure of logistics. This is the story of how Hitler's finest army, poised on the edge of victory, was logistically bled dry and destroyed by a fatal underestimation of its enemy, and an even more fatal overestimation of its own capabilities. The road to Stalingrad began in the spring of 1942. Reeling from the failed assault on Moscow the previous winter, Hitler had shifted his focus. He needed a victory, but more importantly, he needed oil. The German war machine was thirsty, and the only gas station big enough to fuel its ambitions was in the Caucasus, at the oil fields of Grozny and Baku. The plan was codenamed Fall Blau, or Case Blue. Army Group South would be split in two. Army Group A would drive south to seize the oil fields, while Army Group B, anchored by the Sixth Army, would strike east to the Volga River, capturing the city of Stalingrad. Its mission was twofold: protect the long, exposed northern flank of the drive south, and cut the Volga, a vital artery carrying oil and supplies from the Caspian Sea to central Russia. The city itself, a long, thin, industrial metropolis named after Stalin, was a secondary objective. But for Hitler, its symbolic name made it a prestige target he could not resist. The offensive began in late June 1942, and at first, it was a spectacular success. The Sixth Army, elite, experienced, and well-equipped, tore through the brittle Soviet defenses. The vast open steppe of southern Russia was perfect tank country, and the Wehrmacht reprised the blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered Europe. But even in this triumph, the seeds of disaster were being sown. The German war machine, especially in the east, was a logistical contradiction. Its armored spearheads were 20th century marvels of engineering and speed. But the vast body of the army that followed them was a 19th century anachronism. Hundreds of thousands of infantry marched on foot. Their supplies, their artillery, their ammunition did not follow in trucks. Germany had a crippling shortage of them, but in horse-drawn wagons, over 1 million horses served the German army on the Eastern Front, and these animals needed to be fed, watered, and rested. This meant that the Sixth Army was, in effect, two armies. A fast-moving armored fist and a slow-moving infantry and supply tail. The further they advanced, the more stretched this logistical tether became. They were advancing into a wasteland. The retreating Soviets burned everything, and the partisans tore up the railway lines. The Soviet rail gauge was different from the German one, meaning every single mile of track had to be physically relayed by German railway engineers just to get supply trains to the front. By the time the Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in August, it was at the end of a supply line that stretched over 1,500 miles from Germany. It was a logistical marvel that they had made it at all, but it was a marvel balanced on a knife's edge. This fragile supply line now had to support one of the most brutal battles in human history. The fight for Stalingrad was not the Bewegungskrieg the Sixth Army had been designed for. It was Radenkrieg, the Rad War, a septic, close-quarters brawl fought not in open fields, but in sewers, basements, and shattered factory halls. The average life expectancy of a new soldier at the front was 24 hours. The Germans would capture a room, and the Soviets would hold the kitchen. The battle was fought with submachine guns, sharpened shovels, and grenades. This type of warfare is insatiably hungry. It consumes ammunition, medical supplies, and men at a terrifying rate. The Sixth Army, already at the end of its supply tether, was now burning through its resources in a high-intensity inferno, fighting for every street, every building, every pile of rubble. General Paulus, the methodical staff officer, would meticulously calculate the daily expenditure of 7.92mm machine gun rounds, 50mm mortar shells, and bandages. And every day the numbers grew more desperate. While the Sixth Army was myopically focused on capturing the last grain elevator or factory hall, the Soviet High Command, under General Georgy Zhukov, was playing a different game. They saw the bigger picture. They saw the Sixth Army's obsession, and they saw its fatal, exposed flank. While Paulus threw his elite divisions into the meat grinder of the city, the 60-mile-long flank north of Stalingrad and the 60-mile-long flank to the south were not held by German troops. They were held by Germany's allies, the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, along with Italian and Hungarian divisions. These Allied soldiers were not just poorly equipped, they were catastrophically so. They lacked effective anti-tank guns, they had no heavy artillery, their morale was non-existent, and they were freezing in their thin-soled boots. They were the brittle crust around the Sixth Army's iron core. Zhukov knew that if he punched this crust, it wouldn't bend, it would shatter. In the utmost secrecy, under the cover of the harsh Russian winter, the Soviets began to mass two enormous pincer groups on these fragile flanks. An army of over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and 13,000 artillery pieces was quietly assembled. On November 19, 1942, in the middle of a raging blizzard, the sky exploded. The Soviets unleashed Operation Uranus, a barrage from thousands of Stalin's organs. The terrifying Katyusha rockets tore into the Romanian positions. Then came the T-34 tanks, hundreds of them, rolling out of the fog, their wide tracks floating over the snow that had immobilized the German panzers. The Romanian Third Army to the north was not defeated. It was vaporized. It ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force in a matter of hours. The next day, the southern pincer attacked, smashing the Romanian Fourth Army with equal, brutal efficiency. The Sixth Army, its veterans still fighting house to house inside Stalingrad, suddenly heard the sound of gunfire coming from behind them. It was a sound that should have been impossible. The trap was closing. On November 23rd, the two Soviet spearheads met at Kalach, and the circle was complete. Paulus and his 250,000 men were cut off. The immediate, rational, military decision was to break out, to turn the Sixth Army around and punch west to link up with German relief forces. Paulus frantically messaged Hitler's headquarters, requesting freedom of action. The request went up the chain to Hitler himself, who was in a rage. He would not permit his best army to retreat. He turned to the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, and asked if the Air Force could supply the Sixth Army. Göring, without consulting his air fleet commanders, without looking at a single logistical table, made a promise that would seal the Sixth Army's fate. "My Führer," he boasted, "I guarantee the supply of the Sixth Army from the air." For Hitler, this was the answer he wanted. The Sixth Army would stand fast. It would be his fortress Stalingrad. But Göring's promise was not just an exaggeration. It was a mathematical fantasy. And every man in the Sixth Army, from General Paulus down to the last private huddling in a frozen foxhole, was now a dead man walking. Hermann Göring's boast was not just a lie. It was a mathematical impossibility. A fantasy that would be paid for with the lives of over 250,000 men. Back in the frozen Kessel, or cauldron, General Paulus's staff, known for their meticulous calculations, did the grim arithmetic. They were not dealing with political prestige. They were dealing with calories and bullets. Their initial, desperate calculation was that the Sixth Army needed a bare minimum of 700 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness. This included food, ammunition, medical supplies, and, crucially, fuel for the 100 or so tanks still operational and for the generators that ran the command posts and radio equipment. Upon hearing this figure, the Luftwaffe command, in a fit of panic damage control, renegotiated it down to a supposedly manageable 500 tons per day. Paulus, desperate for any good news, finally signaled Hitler's headquarters that a minimum of 300 tons per day might sustain a defensive posture, though this was a catastrophic gamble. Göring, ignoring all of these figures, publicly promised Hitler he could deliver. The Führer, hearing what he wanted to hear, ordered Fortress Stalingrad to be held at all costs. The man tasked with fulfilling Göring's impossible promise was Field Marshal Wolfram von Richthofen, the commander of Luftflotte 4, or Air Fleet 4. Unlike his boss Göring, Richthofen was a brilliant, cynical, and brutally pragmatic commander. He was the architect of the air-ground coordination that defined the Blitzkrieg. He had commanded the Condor Legion in Spain and had perfected the use of the Stuka dive bomber. He was also a numbers man. When he heard the order, he was apoplectic. He knew his fleet, exhausted from 5 months of hard campaigning, did not have the resources. He messaged Berlin in a rage, stating that supplying the Sixth Army by air was utterly impossible. His protests were ignored. The airlift was ordered to begin. The backbone of this phantom airlift was the Junkers Ju-52, affectionately known as Tante Ju, or Aunt Ju. The Ju-52 was a remarkable aircraft for its time. A rugged, reliable, all-metal, tri-motor transport that could land on the poorest of airstrips. But it was also slow, with a cruising speed of about 160 miles per hour. It was unarmored and defended by only a few light machine guns. It was, in short, a flying coffin in a contested airspace. The other main aircraft pressed into service was the Heinkel He-111, a medium bomber. Using bombers as transports was horribly inefficient. They were not designed to hold bulky cargo. Fuel had to be put in small jerrycans and loaded into the bomb bay by hand. Shells and boxes of bread had to be manhandled into a fuselage that was never meant for them. Furthermore, every bomber used for transport was one less bomber that could be used to strike the Soviet forces that were tightening the noose, to meet the absolute bare minimum requirement of 300 tons per day. The Luftwaffe would have needed to fly at least 150 Ju-52 sorties into the pocket, every single day, assuming each plane could deliver its maximum 2-ton load. But this was a fantasy. It did not account for the 1,000-mile round trip from the main supply bases, the brutal Russian winter, or the enemy. The reality was that the nearest major air bases outside the pocket, Tatsinskaya and Morozovskaya, were themselves under-equipped and buried in snow. The airfields inside the pocket were even worse. There were only 2, Potomnek, the main airfield, and a smaller auxiliary field at Gumrak. These were little more than frozen, flattened patches of steppe. constantly shelled by Soviet artillery and bombed by the Red Air Force. The Soviets were not idle. General Zhukov, having sprung the trap, immediately ordered the creation of an air blockade. Hundreds of Soviet anti-aircraft guns were moved into a dense ring around the pocket. Soviet fighter squadrons, flying rugged Yak-1 and Lavochkin La-5 fighters, were moved to capture German airfields and ordered to patrol the air corridors. For a German transport pilot, the flight into Stalingrad became a descent into hell. They would fly in, often in blizzard conditions, dodging ice and fog. As they descended, they would enter a 30-mile-wide belt of flak, the sky exploding around them in black and red puffs of smoke. Then came the fighters, swarming the slow-moving Ant-Use, their cannons tearing through the thin aluminum skin. The airlift began on November 24, 1942. It was a disaster from the first day. Instead of the promised 500 tons, or the minimum 300, a mere 29 tons arrived. The next day, 50 tons. On November 26th, 0 tons arrived. The weather, which Göring had conveniently forgotten, had closed in completely. For the rest of November, the airlift averaged less than 54 tons per day, less than 1/5 of the bare minimum survival requirement. Inside the pocket, the Führer's promise had become a cruel joke. The Sixth Army's 250,000 men were consuming their last reserves of food. The first drastic ration cuts were ordered. The daily bread ration, the staple of the German soldier, was cut from 350 grams to 200 grams, and then to 100 grams. A single, thin, frozen slice of bread. The tens of thousands of horses trapped with the army were the first to go. They were slaughtered for meat, but this was only a temporary reprieve. The cold was a relentless enemy. Temperatures plunged to -20, then -30 degrees Celsius. The soldiers lacked winter clothing. They were still in the summer uniforms they had worn in August, their thin greatcoats and leather boots completely inadequate. Frostbite set in, then gangrene. The wounded, crammed into unheated cellars with no medicine, died in the thousands. The great, invincible Sixth Army was not being defeated. It was freezing and starving to death, all because of a single, impossible number. As the calendar turned to December 1942, the situation inside the Stalingrad Kessel devolved from a crisis into a full-blown catastrophe. The meager rations were cut again. The 100-gram slice of bread was now the entirety of a day's solid food. Soldiers lucky enough to be near a field kitchen received a cup of thin, watery soup, often made from the boiled bones of the last slaughtered horses. Men began to die of starvation, their bodies gaunt, their faces hollowed out, their uniforms hanging on them like rags. The cold was an omnipresent tormentor. At -30 degrees, engine oil froze solid. Tank and truck engines could not be started unless a fire was lit beneath the oil pan, a desperate measure that consumed precious, irreplaceable fuel, and often set the vehicle ablaze. Weapons ceased to function. The sensitive mechanisms of machine guns froze, and rifle bolts had to be worked with agonizing slowness. Frostbite was rampant. The field hospitals, located in frozen basements and bunkers, became houses of death. There were no more anesthetics, no more antibiotics, and soon no more bandages. Wounded men were left to die, their limbs turning black with gangrene. The air was filled with the constant, low-level sound of artillery and the hopeless moans of the dying. Outside the pocket, the Luftwaffe was paying for Göring's promise in blood. The air crews of Luftflotte 4 flew with suicidal courage, but they were fighting a battle against mathematics. The two main airfields inside the pocket, Potomnik and Gumrak, were scenes of apocalyptic chaos. They were under constant Soviet artillery fire. Every landing was a gamble, the pilot dodging shell craters on the runway, while Soviet fighters strafed the field. There was no ground control, no landing lights. Wrecked Ju-52s and He-111s littered the edges of the runways, their blackened skeletons a testament to the failed missions. For the transport crews, the greatest terror was the Soviet flak. The air corridor into the pocket was perhaps the most heavily defended patch of sky on Earth. The Soviets had concentrated hundreds of anti-aircraft guns in a dense ring. A pilot flying into this wall of steel described it as flying through a chimney of fire. And then there were the fighters, the Red Air Force, flying their fast, maneuverable Yak and Lavochkin fighters, owned the air. They were on the roof, waiting for the slow, clumsy Ant Goose to appear. The Ju-52, with its single dorsal machine gun, was defenseless. The transports were shot down in horrifying numbers. The daily tonnage reports, cabled to Hitler's headquarters, told the real story. On December 2nd, 154 tons arrived. A good day. On December 7th, only 65 tons. On December 9th, 26 tons. From December 13th to December 20th, a period of 8 straight days, the average was a pathetic 51 tons per day. The airlift was not just failing to meet the minimum 300 tons, it was failing to deliver even 1/5 of what was needed. The Sixth Army was consuming itself. It was burning its last fuel, firing its last shells, and eating its last scraps of food. All the while, the daily messages from the Führer's headquarters arrived, disconnected from reality, ordering them to hold the line and promising that supply is assured. In mid-December, a single, desperate hope emerged. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps Germany's most brilliant strategist, had scraped together a new army group, Heeresgruppe Dawn, for a relief operation, codenamed Wintergewitter, or Winter Storm. The plan was for the 4th Panzer Army, led by the battle-hardened 57th Panzer Corps, to punch a hole through the Soviet encirclement from the southwest and open a corridor to Paulus's trapped army. Manstein's attack began on December 12th and, at first, made surprising progress. His veteran panzer crews, fighting in blizzard conditions, pushed the exhausted Soviet forces back, clawing their way northeast towards the pocket. Inside Stalingrad, the soldiers of the Sixth Army listened to the sound of the guns. For the first time in weeks, they could hear the distinct sharp crack of German tank cannons, not just the dull boom of Soviet artillery. The relief force was getting closer. By December 19th, Manstein's spearheads had fought their way to the Maishkova River, a frozen creek just 30 miles from the edge of the Stalingrad pocket. 30 miles. For a panzer division, this was an hour's drive in normal conditions. But these were not normal conditions. The 4th Panzer Army was exhausted. Its tanks were running low on fuel, and Soviet resistance was stiffening by the hour as Zhukov diverted 2 entire armies to stop the relief effort. Manstein realized he could go no further on his own. He radioed Paulus, begging him to launch a breakout attack, codenamed Donnerschlag, or Thunderclap. Paulus was to gather his last remaining tanks and punch southwest, to link up with Manstein's waiting panzers. This was the last chance, the only chance. Paulus, the ever-obedient staff officer, radioed Hitler's headquarters for permission to break out. The answer came back, hard and absolute, from the Führer himself: no. The Sixth Army was to stand fast. Fortress Stalingrad was not to be abandoned. Hitler, still clinging to Göring's fantasy, believed the fortress could be held and supplied. For Paulus, this was a moment of terrible indecision. He was a general caught between his military duty to save his men and his sworn oath of loyalty to his Führer. He chose loyalty. He informed a horrified Manstein that he could not break out without a direct order. Manstein's relief force, unable to advance and with its own flanks now threatened, had no choice but to halt, and then to retreat. The sound of the German guns to the southwest grew fainter, and then fell silent. The last hope was gone. As Christmas 1942 approached, a funereal despair settled over the pocket. The Sixth Army, betrayed by its own high command, was left to its fate. The end of Operation Winter Storm was the final nail in the Sixth Army's coffin. As the new year of 1943 began, the Kessel entered its death agony. The situation, already catastrophic, descended into something medieval. The daily ration was cut to 50 grams of bread, a handful of crumbs, and a thin soup made from melted snow and horse gristle. Soldiers, driven mad by hunger, dug up the frozen corpses of their slaughtered horses, chipping away at the icy flesh with bayonets. When the horses were gone, they turned to dogs, cats, and finally, rats. Ammunition was almost non-existent. Artillery batteries were permitted to fire only 1 or 2 shells per day, and only at direct, visible targets. The infantry in the frozen trenches had only the rounds and their rifles. There was no more fuel. The last remaining tanks and trucks were immobile, frozen statues of steel, useful only as windbreaks. The greatest torment, beyond the hunger, was the cold. Temperatures remained at a steady minus 30 degrees Celsius. The men had no winter clothing. They wrapped their frozen, bootless feet in rags and straw. They tore insulating material from cables and stuffed it into their tunics. Frostbite led to epidemic gangrene. The field hospitals were scenes from Dante's Inferno. Over 30,000 wounded men lay in frozen, filth-encrusted cellars, many lying directly on the icy ground, their bodies piled next to the dead and dying. There were no medicines, no painkillers, and no bandages. Surgeons, their hands blackened with frostbite, performed amputations with ordinary handsaws, with no anesthetic. The only mercy was the typhus epidemic that began to rage through the pocket, granting a delirious, feverish end to the suffering. The airlift, the Führer's great promise, had completely collapsed. On January 10, 1943, the Soviets, having methodically crushed Manstein's relief force, turned their full attention back to the pocket. They launched Operation Ring, the final liquidation. 7 Soviet armies, with over 200,000 men and thousands of artillery pieces, began to hammer the German perimeter from all sides. The main German airfield at Potomnik, the pocket's primary lung, was overrun on January 16. This forced the remaining Luftwaffe transports to fly into the tiny cratered airstrip at Gumrak, which was now under direct tank and anti-aircraft fire. Landings became suicidal. On January 21st, Gumrak 2 was captured. The airlift was over. The last tiny trickle of supplies was now dropped by parachute, most of which drifted into Soviet-held territory. The Sixth Army was completely cut off, left to die. Inside the shrinking pocket, the army disintegrated. Coherent units ceased to exist, replaced by huddled groups of frostbitten, starving men whose only thought was survival. General Paulus, isolated in his bunker, had lost all control. He was no longer commanding an army. He was presiding over a mass grave. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of the Nazis coming to power, Hitler sent Paulus a fawning radio message, promoting him to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall or Field Marshal. The message was not a congratulation. It was a command to commit suicide. No German field marshal in history had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to shoot himself and take the army with him. But Paulus, the dutiful officer to the end, would not. He was a devout Catholic and refused to take his own life. On January 31st, 1943, Soviet shock troops stormed the Univermag department store in the center of the city, where Paulus had his final headquarters. They found the new field marshal and his staff in the basement, starving, lice-ridden, and broken. Paulus surrendered. Over the next 2 days, the remaining pockets of resistance, leaderless and out of ammunition, followed. On February 2, 1943, all fighting in Stalingrad ceased. Of the over 250,000 German and Allied soldiers who had been encircled in November, just 91,000 remained alive to surrender. The rest were dead, lost to combat, starvation, or the freezing cold. But the ordeal was not over. These 91,000 survivors, already ghosts, were marched off into Soviet captivity, forced to walk for hundreds of miles in the bitter cold, With no food, they died by the thousands along the way. Of the 91,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad, only 5,000 would ever see Germany again, the last returning home over a decade later, in 1955. The destruction of the Sixth Army was more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological turning point that broke the back of the Third Reich. It was the first time an entire German army had been not just defeated, but utterly annihilated. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, the foundation of Hitler's power, was shattered forever, and it was shattered not by a superior tank or a tactical blunder, but by a simple, brutal equation of logistics. The Sixth Army at Stalingrad was a modern mechanized force that was logistically sustained by horses. It was an army at the end of a supply line so long and fragile that it could not sustain high-intensity combat. When that line was cut, its fate was sealed. Göring's promise to supply it by air was a fantasy born of arrogance and ignorance, a lie that condemned 250,000 of Germany's best soldiers to a slow, agonizing death. Stalingrad was a logistical strangulation, a testament to the cold, hard fact that in modern warfare, courage is useless, and tactics are irrelevant when an army runs out of food, fuel, and bullets.